The morning sun had not yet risen, yet the world already felt heavy for young Tunde, who stood beside his basket of oranges as though guarding the last hope his family had left. The air was cool, the streets nearly silent, and in that silence lived a hunger deeper than his empty stomach, a hunger woven into his spirit, warning him that today held something different. Even before the market awakened, he sensed a change approaching, quiet but powerful, as though the universe had paused to watch what he would choose to become. Tunde's small hands hovered over the oranges, wiping them gently with the corner of his faded shirt. He treated each fruit with a tenderness people rarely offered him, seeing in them not produce, but possibility. They were bruised in places, imperfect like his days, but he arranged them with the care of someone who understood the value of things others dismissed. Around him, the market slowly stirred awake, stall owners lifting wooden shutters, the scent of simmering porridge drifting from food vendors, tires rolling over dusty roads, and faint murmurs growing into familiar chaos. Yet even in the rising noise, Tunde maintained a stillness shaped by years of learning how to quiet the parts of himself that wished for more. Across the street, children in clean uniforms hurried toward school, their laughter ringing brightly through the morning air. Their easy joy pressed against Tunde's chest, stirring a longing he rarely allowed himself to name. He watched them disappear around the bend, his gaze lingering on the road long after they had gone, imagining for one fragile second what it might feel like to hold books instead of baskets, to chase lessons instead of customers, to walk forward without the weight of survival tied around his ankles. But the thought passed quickly. Dreams were luxuries he could not afford, and responsibility always reclaimed him. He inhaled deeply, letting the warm scent of oranges steady his heartbeat. His mother had told him once that sweetness could hide beneath rough skins, and he held that truth close, not only for the fruit he sold, but for himself. He believed quietly and stubbornly that something inside him was meant for more than these mornings, that every sunrise brought not just another day to endure, but another chance to rise. That belief became his anchor, stronger on days when hunger gnawed fiercely at him, whispering doubts he refused to answer. As customers began to flow through the marketplace, he greeted each one with gentle respect. Some paused only briefly, their eyes calculating their coins before moving on. Others bought a single orange out of kindness, offering him small smiles that warmed him more than the early rays of sun. He observed everything with the sharpness of someone forced to grow beyond his age, reading footsteps, expressions, hesitations. Every interaction was a lesson, every sale, a victory, every rejection, an opportunity to strengthen his resolve. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, casting soft light across the market. The shade shifted slowly over his stall, settling across his shoulders like a quiet encouragement. Tunde remained focused, driven by a determination as steady as the ground beneath him. His hunger was constant, but so was his purpose. He knew how to carry both without letting either break him. Then, in the midst of ordinary transactions and ordinary hours, something extraordinary entered his day. A well-dressed man appeared at the edge of the marketplace, his stride measured, his gaze scanning the stalls with a calm intelligence. He moved differently from the others, not hurried, not distracted, not searching for bargains, but observing with a curiosity that made people instinctively step aside. The man's eyes eventually settled on Tunde, watching him with a focus that made the boy straighten his posture, without understanding why. Tunde felt the man's attention like a shift in weather, subtle, yet significant. He continued arranging his oranges, though his heartbeat quickened. There was no threat in the man's expression, only recognition, quiet, thoughtful, almost as if he had found something he had been searching for. The man approached slowly, stopping directly in front of the small wooden table. His eyes did not immediately go to the fruit. They went to Tunde. For a moment, the world around them seemed to blur into insignificance, the chatter fading, the footsteps softening, the sunlight settling into a gentle stillness. Then the man spoke, not with the tone of a customer, but with the seriousness of someone who had come with intention. "What is your name?" he asked, studying Tunde as though the answer mattered in ways the boy could not yet imagine. And in that single question, the path of Tunde's life quietly began to shift. Tunde had learned to identify customers from the way their footsteps approached, some hurried, some distracted, some irritated before even reaching his stall. But the stranger who stopped in front of him that morning carried a presence unlike anything he had felt before. There was no rush in the man's stride, no calculation in his eyes, only a quiet intensity that suggested he had come searching for something far deeper than a basket of oranges. In that moment, the marketplace seemed to rearrange itself around the stranger's stillness, as though waiting to see what would unfold. The man stood for a moment without speaking, his gaze moving over Tunde's stall with admiration rather than scrutiny. Tunde's oranges were not arranged randomly. He placed the ripe ones at the front, the firmer ones at the back, and kept a few slightly blemished fruits aside to offer at a lower price. It was a system he had created instinctively, a strategy shaped by observation, trial, and necessity. He didn't know it held any value beyond survival, but the stranger watched the arrangement with the eye of someone trained to recognize patterns. Others missed. There was something in his expression, respect mixed with curiosity, that made Tunde straighten instinctively. When the man finally spoke, his tone was gentle but deliberate. He asked Tunde how he chose which oranges to display first, how he judged their ripeness, how he remembered which customers preferred softer fruit, and which ones liked the firm ones. Tunde answered quietly, unsure why such questions mattered, yet the stranger listened with the focus of someone hearing solutions rather than simple explanations. Then, almost without warning, the questions shifted, no longer about oranges, but about problems and numbers, logic and memory. The man asked how Tunde would handle different scenarios, having too many ripe oranges, predicting customer flow, calculating profit if he expanded to 2 baskets instead of 1. Tunde responded the only way he knew, honestly, practically, with reasoning carved from lived experience. He didn't realize he was solving problems adults often struggled with. He only knew what the streets had taught him, that survival required quick thinking, adaptation, and the ability to make sense of chaos before it swallowed you whole. The stranger nodded after each answer, his eyes brightening with every insight Tunde offered, as though he were watching a hidden map reveal itself. Tunde expected the man to pick up an orange next, weigh it gently, and haggle as most customers did. But instead, the man reached into his pocket and withdrew a small business card, clean, crisp, and embossed with elegant lettering that looked almost foreign in Tunde's world. He extended it carefully, as though offering something fragile. "You think like someone who solves problems," the man said, his voice low and sincere. "Not someone who is meant to remain here selling fruit." The word struck Tunde with an unexpected force, stirring emotions he didn't know how to hold. His fingers trembled slightly as he accepted the card. He had never owned anything made with such refinement, never touched anything that seemed to belong to a different life entirely. He studied the card's texture, the printed name, the address, all unfamiliar yet strangely reassuring. The stranger didn't push him, didn't overwhelm him with promises. He simply told Tunde that if he ever wished to explore the possibilities his mind held, he should come to the address on the card. Then, with the same calm grace he had arrived with, the man nodded once and walked away, disappearing into the noise of the market as though he had been a passing dream. Tunde stood frozen for a long moment, replaying the encounter in his mind. He tucked the card into his pocket with care, as if it might break if handled too roughly. The market continued around him, vendors shouting prices, children weaving through crowds, the smell of roasted corn drifting through the air. But Tunde felt suspended in a different reality. His hands kept drifting to his pocket. Throughout the day, his fingers brushing the card's smooth edges, reminding him that something extraordinary had happened, something he had not fully understood yet. He questioned everything. Why a stranger would see worth in him. Why someone important would pause long enough to ask him questions beyond fruit. Why his mind felt suddenly too full for the small stall he stood behind. Doubts whispered, but hope whispered louder, shaping a quiet storm of possibility within him. For the first time, he sensed a doorway opening, and though he didn't know what lay on the other side, the thought of stepping through filled him with both fear and wonder. By the time evening settled over Mbala and the market began to thin, Tunde still hadn't found the courage to tell his mother. He didn't know how to explain something that felt so fragile, so immense, so suddenly real. Instead, he held onto the card, letting its weight anchor him in the truth that someone had seen brilliance in him, brilliance he had never been told he possessed. That night, he placed the card beneath his pillow, afraid to lose it, afraid to believe in it too quickly, yet unable to ignore the spark it had ignited within him. The next morning, as vendors were still setting up and the market remained wrapped in early quiet, a sleek SUV glided toward Tunde's stall, polished, unfamiliar, unmistakably deliberate, and stopped directly in front of him, as though his life had just been summoned into a new chapter. The SUV did not roar into the marketplace the way powerful cars usually announce themselves. It glided in quietly, almost respectfully, as if aware it was entering the fragile world of a boy who had survived on hope thinner than morning mist. The tinted window lowered slowly, revealing the stranger's calm expression, an expression neither demanding nor impatient, but deeply attentive, as though he had returned with an answer to a question Tunde had never dared to ask aloud. In that instant, the world around Tunde dimmed into soft edges, leaving only the quiet weight of a possibility he had never imagined would find him. The man introduced himself as Mr. Cairo, a businessman known in the larger cities, but unfamiliar to the marketplace of Mbala. Yet there was nothing intimidating in the way he carried himself. His presence felt grounded, his voice steady in a way that suggested he had spent years listening for brilliance hidden beneath hardship. As he spoke, Tunde sensed that Mr. Cairo saw him not as a vendor, not as a poor child selling fruit, but as a mind waiting for the right doorway. He explained his youth mentorship initiative, an educational program designed to reshape lives from the inside out. He described it not as charity, but as investment in rare resilience, in children who had learned to think by navigating the unpredictable rhythm of survival. Tunde listened carefully, his hands clasped behind his back, fighting the rising tide of disbelief that threatened to unsteady his breath. He had grown up in a world where opportunities did not arrive wrapped in quiet kindness. They often arrived disguised as labor, sacrifice, or impossible choices. And so, even as Mr. Cairo spoke, a part of Tunde hesitated, unsure whether he should trust a man who claimed to see potential where so many people never bothered to look. But another part of him, the part shaped by early mornings, silent determination, and unspoken dreams, leaned in, absorbing every detail with the hunger of someone who understood the value of a single chance. When the offer settled fully into the air between them, Tunde felt the weight of his mother's face pressing gently against his thoughts. He pictured her tired smile, her hands roughened by years of washing, cooking, and stitching together the little they had left. She relied on the coins he earned each day. She had built her hope on his shoulders. Could he walk away from the role he had carried so responsibly? Could he risk stepping into a future that felt too large for a boy who still slept on a woven mat in a small clay house? Mr. Cairo seemed to sense the storm moving through him. Instead of urging, he simply placed a reassuring hand on the edge of the SUV door and spoke softly. "Some children learn because they are taught," he said. "Others learn because the world forced them to understand things far too early. You belong to the second group, and minds like yours deserve space to grow." His words did not thunder. They settled gently, like seeds falling into soil ready to awaken. When Tunde returned home that evening, exhaustion tugged at his legs, but his spirit felt strangely alight. He placed the business card on the small wooden table, and his mother approached with curiosity, clouded by worry. As he explained what happened, her expression shifted through waves of disbelief, fear, and something deeper. A quiet, bittersweet pride. She touched the card with fingertips that trembled slightly, as though it were a fragile piece of destiny she feared might slip away if handled without reverence. She listened, not interrupting once, her silence filled with memories of sacrifices she never spoke of. When Tunde finished, she exhaled slowly, her eyes glistening with a gratitude life had not often allowed her to feel. "If the world opens a window," she whispered, her voice carrying more strength than volume, "don't stay locked in a room. Go where your mind can breathe." That night, Tunde barely slept. He lay awake imagining roads he had never walked, buildings he had never seen, lessons he had never been allowed to dream of learning. He imagined becoming someone capable of lifting his mother out of hardship, someone whose knowledge could rebuild the very spaces that had once confined him. His heart pulsed with a mixture of fear and fierce hope. At sunrise, the SUV returned, its polished frame reflecting the soft gold of morning. Tunde approached with his basket held close, not because he needed to sell it anymore, but because it symbolized where he came from, the foundation of everything he had become. Mr. Cairo opened the door with a nod of encouragement, and Tunde stepped inside with steady determination, carrying nothing but courage and the weight of a future quietly awakening inside him. The journey to the city unfolded like a story he had never believed could include him. Fields stretched wider, roads grew smoother, buildings rose taller. The air itself felt different, quicker, sharper, filled with the pace of a world shaped by ambition rather than survival. Tunde pressed his palms against his knees, absorbing every detail with unfiltered wonder. But as the SUV entered the heart of the city, surrounded by towering structures and faces moving with purpose, he struggled to decipher. Tunde realized with a tightness in his chest that he had stepped into a world where his old instincts were only the beginning, and this new life would demand far more than the courage it took to leave home. The training center hummed with a restless energy Tunde had never felt before, alive with the dreams of dozens of young people who carried ambition in their eyes, like fire waiting for direction. The air pulsed with the chatter of minds awakening, ideas drifting like sparks searching for a place to land. And Tunde stood at the entrance, wondering whether he belonged in a world built not for survival, but for possibility. In that moment, he felt the quiet shift of destiny settling gently around him, urging him to step forward. The compound itself looked nothing like the dusty market he had grown up in. Tall glass windows gleamed under the morning sun, wide hallways echoed with purposeful footsteps, and classrooms buzzed with the rhythm of learning rather than the urgency of trade. For Tunde, every corner held its own kind of shiny computer screens glowing within he had never encountered, whiteboards covered in diagrams he struggled to and instructors taught himself endurance when the world offered him nothing else. And soon, that resilience began to bloom in ways no one expected. Tunde discovered that the instincts he had sharpened in the marketplace translated powerfully into the new world he had stepped into. He understood patterns before they were explained, sensed solutions before others recognized the problem. When a project required organizing resources, he approached it with the same logic he once used sorting oranges by ripeness. When a lesson introduced economic flow, he recalled how customer behavior shifted during market seasons. Even teamwork came naturally. He had spent years navigating the unspoken rules of street vendors, understanding personalities through posture and tone. What others learned from textbooks, he recognized from lived experience. It wasn't long before instructors began noticing his quiet brilliance. During group challenges, Tunde's ideas often reframed entire conversations. He once redesigned a simple irrigation model using household materials, turning a basic assignment into a practical solution that impressed the center's staff. Another day, he mapped out a budget system for a mock business with the precision of someone trained, not taught. His classmates began seeking him out for help, drawn by the calm and clarity he carried even when the work was difficult. Mr. Cairo observed him closely, stepping in as mentor with a steady presence that guided rather than controlled. Their conversation stretched long into evenings, not with lectures, but with reflections, about how ideas grow, how communities thrive, how businesses can rise from the simplest seeds of thought. Cairo taught him to see not just potential, but responsibility, not just profit, but purpose. Under his guidance, Tunde realized that knowledge was not a destination. It was a tool, a compass, a bridge between the person he had been and the person he could become. Late nights became Tunde's sanctuary. While others rested, he lingered in the study rooms, absorbing lessons in technology, economics, leadership, and community development. He read with the same hunger he had once felt for food, devouring every concept with reverence. The more he learned, the more he uncovered parts of himself he didn't know existed. Education didn't just widen his understanding. It healed silent wounds he had carried since childhood. It soothed the ache of being overlooked, strengthened the spaces where fear had once lived, and rebuilt the confidence life had fractured. The transformation was slow, subtle, and profound. His posture straightened, his voice steadied, his ideas grew bolder. He began to imagine solutions not just for himself, but for the community he had come from. His dreams expanded beyond survival, reaching toward impact, innovation, and healing for people who lived the way he once did. The boy who once sold oranges now carried visions large enough to reshape the world. But destiny rarely allows growth without testing its strength. One evening, as he was reviewing a presentation for the center's upcoming innovation showcase, a staff member hurried toward him with an expression that tightened the air around them. She handed him a handwritten note, unexpected, urgent, bearing his mother's name in trembling ink. The message carried news that struck deeper than any challenge he had prepared for, a truth capable of pulling him backward, just as his future was beginning to open. And as he read the final sentence, the world he had carefully built inside the training center threatened to shift beneath his feet. The moment Tunde heard the trembling voice on the phone, the world seemed to tilt beneath him, as if the ground itself had been pulled away. The caller spoke his mother's name with a quiet urgency, explaining that she had collapsed earlier that afternoon, and the words struck him with a force deeper than fear, because he knew how long she had been hiding her pain. In that instant, everything he had built in the city felt small compared to the fragile life waiting for him at home. Tunde left the training center before his thoughts could settle, the long journey back to Umbala unfolding like a blur of guilt and desperate prayers. The road that once symbolized opportunity now felt like a bridge stretched painfully between two worlds, one offering growth, and the other holding the beating heart of everything he loved. When he finally reached their small clay home, he found his mother resting on the thin mat where he had slept for years. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale beneath the dim lantern light. Yet she managed a soft smile when she saw him, as though determined to reassure him even from weakness. He knelt beside her quietly, taking in the truth that had been hiding behind her gentle smiles for far too long. Years of undernourishment, exhaustion, and silent sacrifice had taken their toll, and she had endured it with the grace of someone who believed her suffering was a necessary price for her child's future. Tunde felt a heavy ache swell in his chest, an ache shaped by the realization that while he had been building dreams in the city, she had been giving away pieces of herself to protect the little he once had. He blamed himself for leaving her behind, for not recognizing the signs sooner, for believing that ambition could run alongside responsibility without colliding. But she placed a trembling hand on his cheek, her touch still warm, despite her frailty. "My son," she whispered, her voice thin but filled with a strength he had always admired. "Your wings were meant to fly. Don't clip them because you fear leaving me behind. I am proud because you left. Proud because you dared." Her words softened the sharp edges of his guilt, yet deepened his understanding of the fragile line between poverty and survival, a line she had walked for years with quiet endurance. As she rested through the night, Tunde sat beside her, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing and reflecting on everything he had learned since leaving home. He realized that knowledge had given him more than opportunity. It had given him clarity. He now understood how cycles of hunger formed, how communities weakened under economic strain, how people like his mother bore the weight of society's failures on their backs. He saw not just their poverty, but the systems that created it, the neglect that allowed it to thrive, and the silence that let it continue, unchallenged. He also realized something else. He could no longer pursue success only for himself. Every page he had studied, every lesson he had absorbed, every late-night challenge he had overcome, now pointed him toward a purpose larger than ambition. He vowed that if he returned to the city, it would not be for wealth or comfort, but for transformation. He would rise, but not alone. He would carry his mother's strength with him, her sacrifices stitched into the foundation of everything he would build. Her collapse became his turning point, the moment he understood that dreams meant nothing unless they lifted others with them. Over the next few days, her health began to stabilize slowly, her strength returning in small breaths, small movements, small smiles. Each sign of recovery rekindled a fire inside Tunde, reminding him why he needed to continue, why he needed to rise high enough to change the story of families like his. When she could finally sit upright, she reached for his hand and squeezed it gently, pride shining through her tired eyes. He knew then that she did not want him to stay out of fear. She wanted him to leave with purpose. Before returning to the city, Tunde knelt beside her mat and made a quiet promise. "One day," he whispered, his voice steady with conviction, "hunger will bow in this town. I will not stop until it does." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the relief of seeing the man he was becoming. Her son was no longer the boy selling oranges. He was becoming the man who would rewrite the future those oranges had once symbolized. The morning he left again, he took one last look at her, memorizing her gentle smile, her slow breath, her renewed strength. The road back to the city no longer felt like a separation. It felt like the beginning of a mission that had finally found its voice. By the time the skyline of the city rose before him again, his purpose had sharpened into something undeniable. And as he stepped back into the training center, carrying both the weight of his mother's struggle and the clarity of his new resolve, Tunde began shaping an idea rooted in memory, necessity, and the unbreakable promise he intended to keep. An idea that would soon change countless lives. Tunde stared at his sketchbook as the lines he absent-mindedly drew curved into familiar shapes, round silhouettes that glowed in his memory like tiny suns. Only when he paused did he realize those circles weren't designs at all. They were oranges, the same fruit he once sold barefoot on sandy roads. And in that quiet moment, he understood the truth stirring beneath his fingertips. He wasn't sketching a thought. He was sketching the beginning of his first vision. The training center buzzed softly around him, a symphony of ambition rising from keyboards, hushed conversations, and the determined scratching of pens. Yet Tunde was lost in a world inside the pages before him. Every circle he drew carried a piece of his childhood. Every arrow connecting them carried a possibility he had never allowed himself to imagine before. He leaned closer, letting his memories merge with his growing knowledge. Slowly, an idea formed. An idea shaped by hunger, resilience, and the faces of young vendors who still stood under the scorching sun, waiting for a miracle that rarely came. He began outlining a fair supply network, a system that would support street vendors like the boy he once was. His plan revolved not around profit, but dignity, ensuring vendors received fresh produce at honest prices, ensuring that children selling fruit after school could keep more than a handful of coins, ensuring that families relying on these small earnings could breathe without fear of hunger, tightening its grip each night. He imagined training workshops, small savings groups, and supply stations that didn't exploit the poor, but built them up. He imagined mentorship programs rooted in compassion rather than charity. In his mind, this was not a business. It was a lifeline disguised as one. When he finally presented the idea to Mr. Cairo and a panel of investors, his voice carried the quiet conviction of someone who had lived every problem he intended to solve. The investors listened with unexpected attentiveness, intrigued not by flashy projections, but by the authenticity woven into his proposal. They watched him describe the system with precision, saw the determination behind his calm tone, and recognized the rare clarity that comes from lived experience. By the end of the meeting, the room held a stillness that wasn't doubt. It was respect. The pilot program launched weeks later in a handful of under-resourced neighborhoods, beginning humbly with a small storage facility, a distribution van, and a handful of young vendors eager for a chance to change their lives. Tunde spent hours in the streets, teaching them simple techniques: how to arrange fruit to attract customers, how to calculate fair prices, how to manage small savings without slipping into debt. He didn't speak to them like a mentor standing above them. He spoke like someone who had once carried the same basket, felt the same hunger, and whispered the same quiet fears about the next day. Slowly, the change became visible. Vendors who once struggled to sell a dozen oranges now sold baskets full. Families that had lived day to day started saving money for the first time. Children who once feared school fees found hope in their parents' new stability. Even the air around the markets felt different, lighter, brighter, buzzing with the confidence of people beginning to believe in themselves again. And every time Tunde returned to observe the progress, he saw his younger self reflected in the eyes of the boys who waved at him from behind fruit stands. Watching incomes rise filled him with a sense of triumph he hadn't expected. It wasn't the thrill of achievement, not the rush of success or the pride of validation. It was something quieter, far more profound, the realization that one simple idea, drawn from memory and necessity, could ripple through an entire community. He saw how hope spread when given room to grow, how dignity returned when people were empowered instead of exploited. And deep inside, he felt something awaken, an understanding that his vision had only just begun to take root. Yet the more praise his project received, the more attention it drew from unexpected places. Newspapers printed articles highlighting the transformation in the markets. Community leaders visited the pilot sites to witness the change firsthand. His name circulated through entrepreneurial forums, whispered with a mix of admiration and curiosity. But admiration was not the only thing spreading. Envy followed like a shadow, quiet, persistent, and dangerous in a world where influence often outweighed good intent. Tunde began noticing faces he didn't recognize at meetings, businessmen asking questions that felt too strategic, investors expressing sudden interest in sectors that never concerned them before. Mr. Cairo warned him gently that the world of enterprise was not always guided by fairness. Success often invited those who wanted to claim it without understanding the heart behind it. Still, Tunde pressed forward, fueled not by competition, but by responsibility. But even as he planned the next expansion phase, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface, an unseen force stirring, watching, calculating. And one afternoon, as he reviewed progress files alone in the training center, he received a message that made his heartbeat stiffen, the kind of message written with too much courtesy, too much interest, and too much silence between the lines, sent by someone powerful who had just taken notice of him. Tunde had grown used to the rhythm of progress. The steady rise of trust, the quiet expansion of markets, the blossoming confidence of vendors who finally believed they had a chance. But progress, he learned, makes noise even when you're not trying to be heard. And somewhere in the shadows of the city, a man accustomed to controlling the food trade listened to that noise, mistaking Tunde's success for an intrusion rather than a blessing. The sabotage began so subtly that at first Tunde thought it was coincidence. A farmer sent word that a long-standing agreement had suddenly been voided. Another reported that a new contract, one they didn't remember signing, restricted them from working with outsiders. Vendors arrived at distribution points only to find the crates half full, the fruit smaller, the quality suspiciously inconsistent. Prices from wholesalers spiked overnight, leaving the system strained and families worried. None of it felt random, and yet there was no clear culprit, just a tightening noose around the supply chain he had built with such care. Tunde refused to panic. Instead, he observed the pattern with the same sharp awareness he once used in the marketplace to read customers' footsteps and hesitations. He mapped every shortage, every price change, every sudden rule, until the pieces finally aligned into a disturbing truth. A wealthy distributor, one who had dominated the region for years, was quietly orchestrating an attempt to suffocate his model. The man saw Tunde's system not as innovation, but as disruption. And disruption, to him, was something to be crushed before it spread. For a moment, Tunde sat alone in his office, feeling the weight of disappointment settle into his chest. He thought of the vendors who depended on him, the families who relied on the income, the farmers who trusted his fairness. He feared that one man's insecurity could unravel everything he had built. But then he remembered the promise he made to his mother, the vow that hunger would one day bow in their town. That memory rose inside him like a steady flame, pushing back the shadows of doubt. Instead of fighting sabotage with confrontation, he decided to outgrow it. He dismantled the parts of his supply chain that were vulnerable to manipulation and began building a new structure, one rooted directly in partnership with rural growers. It was a bold move, risky even, but Tunde had learned that genuine change required stepping into spaces others feared entering. He traveled to remote farming villages, moving across dusty roads, winding hills, and long stretches of untouched land. He met farmers who had never been approached by distributors except through intermediaries who swallowed most of the profit. He sat with elders beneath mango trees, greeting them with humility and deep respect. He listened to their stories of harvests lost, debts accumulated, promises broken. He didn't come with contracts first, he came with understanding. And when he finally presented his proposal, it was not a demand, not a bargain, but a partnership shaped around fairness, transparency, and mutual growth. The farmers, initially wary, found warmth in his sincerity. They saw not a businessman seeking advantage, but a young man who had once sold oranges with the same hands, now offering them stability. Agreements were formed with handshakes, smiles, and community witnesses before papers were ever signed. And when the new system began, it was stronger than anything he had imagined. Produce flowed directly from Mara, growers to vendors without interference. Prices stabilized, quality improved, trust deepened. The wealthy distributor, expecting his sabotage to cripple Tunde's program, instead watched the model flourish beyond reach. His attempts to disrupt supply now meant little. Tunde's new network bypassed him entirely, and the irony only deepened when farmers he had once ignored began leaving their old contracts behind, choosing Tunde's fairness over the distributor's dominance. People across the city began admiring Tunde, not for winning, but for the way he won, with integrity, transparency, and unshakable respect for those at the bottom of the chain. His approach reminded them that the purpose of business was not to crush competition, but to uplift communities. His story began circulating in youth forums, radio programs, and community gatherings. Even university students wrote papers analyzing how his resilience reshaped the local economy. To every compliment, Tunde responded with humility, reminding listeners that the true heroes were the women and men who harvested the fruit, the children who sold it with hope, and the communities that nurtured the vision behind his strategy. Yet within this celebration of progress, a quieter transformation was taking place inside him. By overcoming sabotage without losing his values, he realized he was capable of more than he had imagined. His system wasn't just feeding families. It was dismantling old structures built on greed and rebuilding them on dignity. And as he studied the growing impact of his work, a new thought began to take root, an idea that felt both frightening and electrifying in its scale. He began to wonder whether hunger, the enemy that shaped his childhood, existed on such a massive scale because people believed it was too large to confront. What if, he thought, the solutions weren't too complex, but too ignored? What if the model he had built could be expanded until it touched not just markets, not just towns, but entire regions? He stared at a map late one night, tracing the lines of borders, rivers, and cities with a kind of reverence, imagining supply chains that fed millions. He felt a fire stir inside him, the same fire that once kept him standing in the marketplace through long, hungry mornings. And in that still moment, as he hovered over the map with trembling possibility in his veins, he whispered a question into the quiet room, a question that would change the direction of his life forever. What if I could fight hunger not just here, but everywhere? There came a moment when Tunde understood that hunger was not simply the gnawing emptiness he had once endured as a child. It was the quiet theft of futures, the silent erasing of dreams, the slow dimming of potential before it could ever bloom. It was a wound carved across generations, hidden behind statistics and policies, yet felt deeply in the breath of every child whose ambition was traded for survival. And, as this realization settled into his spirit, he felt his mission stretch far beyond success, far beyond business, into something vast enough to demand a different kind of courage. Tunde's company was growing rapidly, and yet he sensed a deeper calling beneath the numbers, something that pushed him to reimagine the relationship between farmers, vendors, and cities. He began to question every traditional model he saw, asking himself not how to make the system profitable, but how to make it human. Late nights found him at his desk, sketching diagrams that merged the simplicity of village trade with the precision of modern technology. What if farmers could see real-time demand? What if vendors in overcrowded cities could access quality food without middlemen draining half their earnings? What if waste, one of hunger's cruelest accomplices, could be reduced through smarter storage and routing? Guided by these questions, Tunde envisioned something that had never existed on the continent, a tech-driven food distribution network designed not merely to sell, but to nourish, strengthen, and uplift. He recruited young African engineers who understood both the digital world and the struggles of rural life. Together, they built an app that connected hundreds of farmers directly to urban markets. Prices were transparent, demand charts updated hourly, and routes recalculated by algorithms that treated time and fuel as sacred resources. For farmers who lacked smartphones, kiosks were placed in villages, solar-powered stations where trained facilitators helped input data, ensuring inclusion even for those with little technology experience. Solar storage hubs soon rose across regions, white, clean structures gleaming under the African sun. These hubs kept produce cool without diesel, cutting waste drastically. Transport trucks equipped with sensors monitored freshness and temperature, eliminating the guesswork that had once caused spoilage and financial loss. In cities, distribution points replaced chaotic markets with organized, dignified spaces where vendors could order exactly what they needed and receive it within hours. Fair, predictable pricing became the new normal. Investors saw innovation. Communities saw salvation. For many rural families, it meant stable income for the first time. Farmers who once hesitated to plant large crops now planted boldly, knowing their harvest had a guaranteed path to buyers. Young people who had fled villages in search of city jobs returned home to work in tech-enabled agriculture, finding pride in soil that had once felt like a trap. Mothers no longer rationed meals with fear. Children grew healthier, minds sharper, futures brighter. And at every milestone, Tunde felt the echo of his childhood self. A barefoot boy beneath the rising sun, whispering prayers over a basket of oranges he hoped someone would buy. He carried that memory with reverence, letting it guide each decision. When board members pushed for higher margins, he insisted on keeping staple foods affordable. When global partners suggested cutting out smaller farms, he refused to abandon the people whose hands nurtured the continent. He reminded everyone that the purpose of the system was not wealth, it was dignity. And because his conviction was grounded in lived experience, people listened. They trusted him. They followed him. As the company expanded beyond borders, into Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, Senegal, Tunde traveled widely, stepping into regions where hunger had shaped daily life for decades. In each place, he met families who reminded him of his mother's quiet sacrifices, his own childhood fears, and the untold potential locked behind empty plates. With every handshake, every shared story, he felt his vision deepen. This was no longer business, it was restoration. It was rebuilding what hunger had stolen. The impact rippled faster than he expected. International organizations sought his partnership. Universities invited him to speak about innovation rooted in compassion. Governments requested guidance on how to integrate his model into national food policies. He accepted each opportunity with humility, never letting praise distract him from the responsibility that brought him there. Yet success, like fire, burned brighter the more oxygen it received, and shadows grew with it. Tunde began noticing pressure points emerging in his carefully built system. Markets in regions with unpredictable rainfall fluctuated sharply. Crop yields dropped in areas hit by heat waves. Transport routes altered as water sources dried up prematurely. Farmers spoke with concern about soil hardening and harvest cycles shifting. These were not business problems alone. They were signals, warnings whispered by the land itself. One evening, as he reviewed charts showing declining outputs across multiple regions, a heavy stillness filled the room. The numbers did not lie. They told a story more frightening than financial loss. They revealed the fragility of a continent where millions depended on rain that no longer fell on time, on soil that no longer behaved predictably, on seasons that no longer kept their promises. He closed his laptop gently, feeling a tremor of fear, not for himself, but for the people who had trusted him to be their bridge to a better life. For the first time in years, uncertainty pressed against his chest with the same ghostly weight he remembered from hunger-filled mornings. He walked outside, staring at the horizon as the wind carried dust across the quiet compound. The sky felt different, distant, exhausted, whispering truths no one wanted to hear. And that was when the message arrived. Drought had struck multiple regions at once, crop failure looming like a storm without rain, threatening to unravel everything he had built, and every life now woven into his vision. The drought arrived without mercy, stealing color from the land until fields once golden with promise cracked under the weight of a sky that refused to rain. Rivers that had carried generations of hope shrank into thin, trembling lines of water, leaving behind beds of dust where fish once danced in shimmering currents. And as panic rippled across farming communities, Tunde felt the ground beneath his entire system shift, threatening to pull everything he had built into the same dryness swallowing the land. The first calls came at dawn, farmers reporting wilted crops, shriveled leaves, and soil too hard to till. Within hours, the news spread. Multiple regions were collapsing at once, their harvest cycles destroyed by a heat so relentless that even seasoned agriculturalists struggled to comprehend it. Families who had once stood proudly on their farms now feared the very breath of the wind, for each gust carried the scent of loss. Tunde listened to their trembling voices, feeling their desperation seep into his bones with a heaviness that reminded him of childhood mornings when hunger sat like a stone inside his stomach. He knew that if the system failed now, thousands would fall with it. But retreat had never lived in Tunde's vocabulary. He summoned his core team before sunrise, their faces drawn with urgency, and mapped out an emergency plan grounded in responsibility, precision, and speed. They redirected funds to secure temporary imports of staple foods from surplus regions, negotiating with suppliers across borders while maintaining fairness in pricing. Trucks rolled out in long, determined lines, carrying maize, beans, rice, and vegetables to areas where fields had turned into barren scars beneath the sun. Every hour mattered. Every mile traveled was a quiet fight against encroaching disaster. Tunde introduced mobile kitchens, large solar-powered units capable of traveling deep into remote villages. These kitchens offered warm meals to families who had not tasted a full plate in weeks. Elderly women wept softly into their shawls as bowls of steaming porridge were placed into their hands. Children, once slowed by exhaustion, smiled again as the scent of food drifted through community spaces. In every village he visited, Tunde knelt beside those receiving meals, listening to their stories with a humility that made people trust him even more deeply. They did not see a billionaire. They saw a man who carried their burdens as though they were his own. International agencies noticed the scale of his intervention. Leaders from humanitarian organizations reached out, praising the efficiency and compassion of his response. News networks broadcast images of his trucks crossing long stretches of sunburnt land, and for the first time, the world saw him not merely as a businessman, but as a force reshaping the meaning of leadership. Yet praise never touched his focus. He had known hunger intimately. He had no interest in glory. His attention remained fixed on the mothers dividing one meal between 5 children, on the farmers staring at fields that no longer answered their prayers, on the communities he had promised himself he would never abandon. Still, in the quiet moments between meetings and field visits, the crisis weighed on him. He understood that drought wasn't a temporary disruption. It was a warning. Climate patterns were shifting. Seasons were losing their rhythm. The old ways of farming could no longer stand against a world growing hotter and more unpredictable. The system he had built, strong as it was, had not been designed to fight a crisis of this magnitude alone. Something deeper, stronger, and more innovative was needed, something not yet imagined. Tunde spent long nights studying satellite images, rainfall projections, and soil health data. He traced maps of vulnerable regions, seeking patterns others overlooked. But beyond the data, he heard voices from his past. His mother whispering strength into tired evenings, vendors hustling through crowded markets, farmers quietly enduring droughts that stripped their identity and pride. These memories formed a compass within him, pointing toward a single truth he could no longer ignore. Feeding people during a crisis wasn't enough. Hunger demanded consistency. It demanded systems that held people every day, not only when disaster struck. He realized then that his mission had entered a new phase. No longer could he focus solely on distribution, profit structures, or agricultural logistics. He needed to build resilience that lived in the soil, in the seeds, in the hands of farmers, and in the communities depending on him. His vision would need to evolve into something vast enough to counter not just scarcity, but the forces shaping it. And even as exhaustion pressed against him, the spark of a new idea flickered in his mind, waiting for the right moment to grow into clarity. Before that moment arrived, a visitor stepped into his headquarters, a woman whose name carried weight in the global humanitarian world. Her presence alone signaled that the crisis had drawn international attention deeper than before. She walked into the conference room with calm confidence, her eyes filled not with pity, but with a sharp understanding of the stakes. She didn't waste time on introductions or pleasantries. She placed a folder on the table, its contents thick with plans and possibilities. Her proposal was bold, revolutionary even, and aligned so closely with the pulse of Tunde's heart that he felt his breath pause as she explained it. It was the kind of idea that could shift the future of hunger across the continent. The kind of idea that demanded leaders who were willing to build beyond their own lifetime. And as she finished speaking, Tunde realized this was no ordinary collaboration. This proposal could either transform Africa's food future or break him if he dared to pursue it. The proposal lingered in the room long after the humanitarian leader finished speaking, its simplicity striking Tunde harder than any technical challenge he had ever faced. Feed the hungry every single day. No seasons, no emergencies, no waiting for disaster to strike before action began. It was a call that resonated so deeply within him that the air around him seemed to still, as though the world itself paused to hear his answer. For the first time in years, he felt something rise in him that surpassed ambition. It felt like destiny choosing its moment to speak. As he reviewed the documents laid before him, Tunde realized that the idea was both beautiful and terrifying in its scale. It wasn't a project that needed money alone. It required structure, consistency, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to dignity. It demanded that food reach not only the hungry stomach, but the hungry soul. The child whose dreams were shrinking with each skipped meal. The mother who pretended she had already eaten so her children could survive one more day. The elderly man who still woke before dawn, hoping the world had not forgotten him. This foundation would not simply feed bodies, it would feed futures. And that truth struck him with a force that left him deeply humbled. Tunde moved swiftly. Within weeks, he convened a panel of local nutritionists, community elders, agricultural experts, and young innovators who understood both hunger and hope. Together, they shaped the structure of what would soon become Feed One Africa, a foundation not built on charity, but on restoration. Tunde insisted on one core principle from the beginning. The food must come from African farmers, African kitchens, African hands. Every meal had to strengthen the continent, not create dependency. Every plate had to uphold dignity, not pity. He transformed a significant portion of his profits into seed funding, refusing to wait for global pledges before beginning. His first kitchens opened in regions hardest hit by drought, each one a bustling center where local women and men prepared meals using produce, purchased at fair prices from nearby farms. The model was simple, yet powerful. The hungry were fed, farmers earned income, and communities became partners in healing their own struggles. Soon, small villages that had once been paralyzed by scarcity saw life return. Children running to the kitchens with metal bowls, elders gathering beneath shade trees to share warm meals, young volunteers rediscovering purpose in serving their neighbors. Within months, Feed One Africa was preparing thousands of meals daily. Within 2 years, the number had grown into millions, reaching refugee camps, schoolyards, hospitals, slums, and remote settlements often ignored by policy and forgotten by geography. What astonished people most was not the scale of the operation, but the spirit behind it. Tunde refused to lead from behind polished desks or distant offices. He visited kitchens unannounced, stepping quietly into the space with sleeves rolled up and eyes softened by the same compassion he carried as a child, selling oranges in the hot sun. Workers often gasped upon recognizing him, but he never allowed the ceremony. He joined the lines, stirred pots, washed utensils, and sat with children who spoke of their futures with renewed certainty. His humility became legend. Wealth reshaped itself around him, not as a symbol of status, but as a tool placed into hands willing to serve. He remained unchanged in the spaces that mattered, speaking to elders with respect, listening to farmers with patience, encouraging young volunteers with the quiet assurance that every meal they served was rewriting someone's story. For him, feeding the hungry daily was not a program. It was a promise to his mother, a promise to every child who had ever gone to bed, counting breaths instead of blessings, a promise to the barefoot boy he had once been. Yet amid the expanding success, Tunde often found his thoughts drifting back to the place where his journey had begun, the dusty market of Umbala, where hunger had taught him his first lessons about survival, pride, and perseverance. He remembered his small basket of oranges, the rhythm of footsteps passing by without noticing him, the way the morning light fell unevenly across the worn wooden stalls. He remembered longing for a future he couldn't name, one he had never dared to imagine would bring him here. And with each memory, he felt the weight of something unfinished pressing gently at the edges of his heart. He knew he had touched millions of lives, yet one truth remained. His story had begun with a single hungry boy selling oranges under a rising sun. And no matter how far he traveled, no matter how vast his mission became, destiny always finds its way back to its first spark, its first wound, its first awakening, its first lesson. As Feed One Africa continued to expand, board members encouraged him to celebrate his achievements on an international stage, to receive awards, to speak at global summits. But Tunde declined most invitations with quiet gratitude, choosing instead to focus his attention on the pulse of the foundation, the rhythm of kitchens, the murmurs of communities, the heartbeat of the mission. Still, he felt something pulling at him, calling him toward a place he had not visited in years. He knew where he needed to go next. He knew which ground he must stand upon before taking his mission to its next chapter. And so, with a heart full of purpose, Tunde prepared for one final return. The journey back to the dusty streets where hunger once shaped his destiny, unaware that something extraordinary awaited him there. As Tunde stepped back into the Mbala market, the air shifted around him in a way he had not felt in years, as though the dust rising beneath his shoes was whispering the name he had carried as a child. Sunlight poured unevenly through the gaps in the old zinc roofs, falling across the stalls in familiar broken patterns that once shaped the rhythm of his days. In that moment, the man he had become collided gently with the boy he once was, creating a silence inside him so profound it felt like standing between two versions of his own heartbeat. The market had changed, and yet remained the same. Children still darted between wooden stalls with wide, hopeful eyes. Vendors still called out prices with tired enthusiasm, their voices shaped by years of endurance. The scent of grilled maize, ripened mangoes, and fresh earth still blended into an aroma he could never forget. But what stunned him most was how faces turned toward him one by one, recognition blooming not through his fame, but through the memory of a barefoot boy who once sold oranges with unwavering determination. Older vendors nudged one another, whispering with pride that felt deeper than words. "Our boy came back," one woman murmured, her voice trembling with emotion. Tunde bowed his head gently in greeting, humbled by the warmth that embraced him like family. He walked slowly to the place where his journey had begun, weaving through rows of stalls that held both nostalgia and revelation. When he finally reached the old wooden platform where he used to arrange his oranges, his breath caught. The wood was worn, cracked at the edges, but still carried the faint grain patterns he had traced countless times while waiting for customers. He reached out and placed his hand on the surface, his fingers moving instinctively along grooves etched by years of survival. It felt like touching a memory, warm, fragile, and irreplaceable. In that quiet gesture, he honored the version of himself who had stood there praying for a future he could not yet see. A small crowd gathered around him as news spread through the market. Instead of giving speeches or standing on ceremony, Tunde requested the vendors to gather in the open clearing. With the same humility he carried in boardrooms, he announced that for the entire week, every stall would receive fresh produce free of charge, fruits, vegetables, grains, all sourced from his network and delivered directly to their hands. Gasps rose, followed by joyful cries and tears that shimmered in the hot afternoon light. Elders clasped their hands in gratitude, young sellers exchanged stunned glances, and mothers lifted their children toward him in silent blessing. He watched them distribute the produce with the same joy he once dreamed of tasting. The weight that had once lived on his shoulders, fear of poverty, fear of hunger, fear of obscurity, now felt like a distant echo. He had not come back as a man trying to prove himself. He had come back as a man grateful for the soil that had shaped him. Standing amid the bustling market, he felt emotions layered so deeply that he could barely separate them. Gratitude for the journey, grief for what he had endured, triumph for what he had become, and humility for the lives he now carried within his mission. It felt as though time folded gently around him, allowing him to feel every version of himself at once. As he continued walking, vendors pressed gifts into his hands, small tokens crafted from love and memory. A woman handed him a woven bracelet for protection. An elderly man pushed a tiny carved wooden orange into his palm, saying, "So you never forget the fruit that fed your courage." Children followed him with shy smiles, overflowing with admiration that warmed him more deeply than any accolade he had received abroad. The market, once the ground of his hardship, now stood as witness to his quiet, undeniable victory. Tunde paused near a stall where the scent of freshly peeled citrus drifted through the air. Something about that scent tugged at him. He turned slowly and saw a young boy about the age he had been when everything seemed uncertain. The boy balanced a small basket of oranges against his hip, arranging them carefully in rows that mimicked the methodical precision Tunde had once practiced. His clothes were simple, his sandals worn, but his eyes, dark, burning, determined, held a fire Tunde recognized as intimately as his own reflection. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. It was as though destiny had placed a mirror before him, not to remind him of the path he had walked, but to introduce him to the child whose life might shift because he had chosen to rise. The boy approached shyly, clutching the basket as though it carried all his hopes. "Sir, would you like to buy an orange?" he asked softly, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. In that moment, Tunde felt his purpose awakened with a force that nearly brought him to his knees. He understood that life had brought him here not for nostalgia, but for continuation. The circle was not closing. It was expanding. As Tunde crouched to meet the boy at eye level, something in the child's gaze struck him with unsettling familiarity. Not just ambition, but a story waiting to be rewritten. And before he could speak, the boy whispered a sentence that froze him where he stood. The boy stood before him with a basket far too heavy for his small arms, yet his posture carried a quiet defiance that struck Tunde like a memory resurrected from dust. It felt as though the universe had folded time itself, placing the child he once was directly in front of the man he had become. Two destinies staring at each other across the same soil of survival. Tunde lowered himself slowly, the weight of years settling gently on his shoulders as he came face to face with the boy. The market noise faded into a blurred hum around them, replaced by the soft thunder of his heartbeat as he studied the child more closely. The boy's cheeks were sunken with hunger, but his eyes held a spark that refused to dim, a spark that carried the same stubborn fire Tunde once clung to when the world seemed determined to overlook him. It was not poverty he saw. It was potential wrapped in dust and discipline. The kind of potential no classroom could teach, yet life carved with ruthless precision. The child shifted nervously under his gaze, clutching the basket tighter as though afraid opportunity itself might slip from his fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled with a mixture of courage and desperation. He explained that his grandmother had fallen ill, leaving him as the only one able to bring food into their home. Tunde listened intently, letting each word sink into the spaces of his memory, where his own past lived quietly. Every syllable felt like an echo, a mirror turned toward a life he once carried with bare feet and empty pockets. He remembered waking at dawn, praying for customers who seldom came. He remembered nights where hunger pressed against his ribs like a second skeleton. He remembered confusion stitched with hope, fear stitched with determination, exhaustion stitched with dreams. And standing before this boy, he realized he was not revisiting his past. His past was seeking him with open hands, asking what he would do now that he had the power he once begged the world to show him. Tunde offered the boy a seat beside him on the low wooden bench near his old selling spot. The child hesitated, unsure whether he was allowed to sit beside someone whose name had reached every corner of the region, someone the world now called a billionaire, with a heart too large to fit behind boardroom doors. But when Tunde gestured gently, the child sat, placing the basket between them like a symbol of the life that had shaped them both. He asked the boy a few simple questions, not to test him, but to understand him. Questions about numbers, decisions, prices, and strategy. And to his quiet astonishment, the child answered with a sharpness shaped by survival. The same sharpness Tunde once used to read customers and count hope in fractions. It wasn't education guiding the boy. It was instinct, the kind carved from necessity rather than choice. Tunde felt a tightening in his chest, a mixture of pride and sorrow blending into something profound. He placed a gentle hand on the boy's basket, touching the oranges with reverence. "Do you know," Tunde said softly, "that these little fruits once fed me in ways the world will never understand?" The boy blinked in confusion, unsure whether to believe that a man of Tunde's stature had ever lived a life so closely tied to his own. But Tunde's voice held no embellishment, only truth shaped by humility. He told the boy, not with grandeur but with sincerity, that he saw in him the same restless hunger to rise, the same fire that life had tried to smother but failed. And then he made a decision Tunde had never made lightly. He extended his hand, offering the boy a place in his mentorship program, not as an act of charity, but as the recognition of brilliance too rare to waste. The boy stared at the offered hand, breath catching in his throat, tears gathering at the corner of his eyes as though hope itself was too heavy for his small chest to hold. When he finally placed his hand in Tunde's, it felt like two timelines intertwined, the boy he had been and the man he had become, meeting not by accident but by destiny's deliberate design. The child smiled shyly, the kind of smile that carried both relief and disbelief, and in that moment, Tunde felt a shift inside him, something warm, powerful, and deeply grounding. His journey had never truly been about oranges, business, or wealth. It had always been about people, about lifting those still trapped in the shadows he once escaped, about creating pathways where none existed, about feeding not just stomachs, but futures. As they walked out of the market together, the vendors watched with softened eyes. They understood what they were witnessing was not simply kindness, it was the passing of a torch, a legacy igniting in real time. But as Tunde glanced back at the market, the very ground that had shaped him, he felt a quiet pull in his spirit, a whisper of unfinished purpose. For somewhere across Africa, another child was waiting, and destiny had only just begun revealing where it needed him next. If Tunde's journey touched your heart, then don't leave just yet. Every week, stories like this one remind us that courage can rise from anywhere, even a dusty marketplace. Subscribe now and join a community that believes in hope, resilience, and destiny rewriting itself. Tell us in the comments, which moment hit you the hardest? Your voice keeps this storytelling family alive. And don't forget to turn on notifications. Your next favorite story is already on its way.